My mother-in-law went through my phone while I was unconscious from surgery. She found exactly what I left for her. I went in for gallbladder surgery on a Thursday morning. Simple procedure that my doctor said would take an hour max. My husband Rick dropped me off because he had a huge presentation at work that could get him promoted to regional manager. We agreed he'd come right after his meeting ended around noon. My mother-in-law Diane volunteered to sit in the waiting room in case anything happened. I thought that was sweet, even though she usually made my life hell with her comments about my cooking, my job, my family, and how I wasn't good enough for her precious son. But people change during medical emergencies, right? When I woke up in recovery, still groggy from anesthesia, I saw Diane sitting in the corner chair scrolling through my phone. Not just looking at it, but actually reading messages and looking at photos. She was so focused she didn't notice I was awake. I stayed still and watched her open my banking app, my email, my texts with Rick. She took pictures of my screen with her own phone. She went through my photos and deleted some, including ones from my best friend's bachelorette party. She even went into my work emails and forwarded herself documents from my boss about an upcoming promotion I hadn't told Rick about yet. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, Diane quickly put my phone on the table and acted like she'd been reading a magazine. She told the nurse I'd been mumbling strange things under anesthesia and asked if that was normal. The nurse said it was fine and left. Diane picked up my phone again immediately. That's when I pretended to wake up. Diane jumped and said she was just checking the time. She'd already changed my phone wallpaper from a picture of me and Rick to one of just Rick from before we met. She said Rick called to say his meeting was running late and asked her to stay with me. Then she started asking weird questions about why I had certain male contacts in my phone and who they were. They were all work colleagues, but she acted like she'd caught me cheating. When Rick finally arrived, Diane pulled him into the hallway. I could hear her telling him she was concerned about some things she noticed while I was unconscious. She said I'd been saying another man's name and that maybe the anesthesia made me reveal something. Rick came back confused, asking me about someone named Jordan. That's my boss who Diane saw in my emails. I told him Jordan was my boss, but Diane kept pushing, saying it seemed like more than that from how I talked about him. She actually convinced Rick to look through my phone right there in the hospital. I was too weak to fight about it, so I just let them. That's when I started planning. After I got home, Diane came over every day to help with my recovery. Really, she was snooping through everything. She went through our closets, our filing cabinet, even our garbage. She'd ask Rick why we had receipts from certain restaurants or why I bought specific items. She found an old birthday card from a college friend named Daniel and made a huge deal about it being romantic when it just said happy birthday. She started poisoning Rick against me with little comments about how secretive I seemed and how many male friends I had. 2 weeks into recovery, I was ready. I bought a second phone that looked exactly like mine. I loaded it with the most boring, innocent content possible, but added some interesting things for Diane to find. I created fake text conversations with my mom about how wonderful Diane was and how lucky I was to have her. I added photos of gifts I was supposedly planning to buy her for Christmas. I put fake emails about planning a surprise party for her birthday. Then I added one group chat titled MIL Support Group, where I seemingly vented to other daughters-in-law. But the messages were all about how we wished we were closer to our mothers-in-law and sharing ideas to bond with them. The kicker was a draft email to Rick about how I wanted to ask Diane to move in with us because she seemed lonely. I left this phone on the kitchen counter when I knew Diane was coming over while I napped. Sure enough, she took the bait. She went through the entire thing. She saw all the fake nice things about her and got suspicious. She knew I didn't like her that much, so something had to be wrong. She started panicking that maybe I was trying to manipulate her or Rick. She called Rick at work, freaking out about how I was plotting something because nobody could actually want her to move in. She said the support group was probably making fun of her, and the surprise party was a trick to embarrass her. Rick was confused why she was going through my phone while I was sleeping. She admitted she'd been checking it regularly to protect him. That's when Rick realized his mom had been the one creating problems between us. Rick walked through the door around 6:30 and dropped his briefcase on the floor with a heavy thud. His tie hung loose around his neck and his shirt had wrinkles across the front like he'd been gripping the fabric. He looked at me sitting on the couch and his face showed confusion mixed with something that might have been anger, or maybe just exhaustion. He asked what was going on with his mother and why she called him at work having a complete meltdown about my phone. I could see him trying to figure out who was telling the truth. His mom had been in his ear for weeks now, planting seeds of doubt about me. But today, something in her panic call must have sounded off to him. He stood there waiting for an answer, his jaw tight and his hands opening and closing at his sides. I stayed calm even though my heart was beating fast. I told him I'd been home recovering from having my gallbladder cut out of my body while his mother went through every drawer, closet, and piece of paper in our house. I said that today I left a phone on the counter to see if she'd go through it while I was sleeping, and she did exactly what I expected. Rick's face went from confused to pale in about 2 seconds. His mouth opened a little and he stared at me like I'd just told him I was secretly a spy or something. I could see him processing what I said, trying to decide if he should be mad at me for setting up his mother, or disturbed that she failed the test so completely. He ran his hand through his hair and sat down on the chair across from me, not the couch next to me, which told me everything about where his head was at right now. He said his mother told him I had a second phone and that I was plotting something against her. She'd sounded genuinely scared on the call, like I was some kind of threat to her safety or her relationship with him. I got up slowly because my incision still pulled when I moved too fast, and I grabbed both phones from the kitchen counter. I handed him my real phone first and watched him scroll through my actual messages, my real emails, my genuine photos of us and my friends and my family. Then I gave him the decoy phone and let him see the fake conversations about how wonderful his mother was and the draft email about asking her to move in with us. His eyes got wider as he read through the support group messages about wanting to be closer to mothers-in-law. He looked up at me, and I saw the exact moment when he understood what had happened. His mother had seen all this nice stuff about herself and immediately assumed it was fake or manipulative because she knew I didn't actually like her that much. She'd panicked and called him at work to warn him that I was plotting something, and in doing so, she'd revealed that she'd been going through my phone without permission. Rick put both phones down on the coffee table and dropped onto the couch like someone had cut his strings. He asked how long I'd known his mother was going through my phone, and his voice came out quiet and kind of hollow. I sat down next to him, leaving some space between us, and told him about waking up in recovery. I described watching her scroll through my banking app while I was still groggy from anesthesia, seeing her take pictures of my screen with her own phone, watching her delete photos from my best friend's party. I told him about the nurse walking in and how his mother pretended she'd been reading a magazine, then went right back to my phone the second the nurse left. Rick's face turned a grayish color, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He said he felt sick. His mother had violated my privacy while I was unconscious and vulnerable from surgery, and he'd believed her story about me saying another man's name under anesthesia, instead of questioning why she was even looking at my phone in the first place. I kept talking because he needed to hear all of it. I told him how she'd come over every single day during my recovery, supposedly to help me but really to go through our stuff. She'd reorganized our kitchen cabinets and made comments about my terrible organization skills. She'd gone through our bedroom closet and questioned why I owned certain dresses or shoes. She'd dug through our filing cabinet and asked Rick about old receipts she found. She even went through our garbage and brought up a takeout container from a restaurant we'd gone to months ago, asking Rick if we went there a lot and who we went with. Rick's face changed as I talked. He started connecting things his mother had asked him over the past 2 weeks. All those weird questions about my coworkers and college friends, all the comments about how secretive I seemed, all the concern about my male contacts. It hadn't been motherly worry. It had been her reporting back on what she'd found while snooping through our house and my phone whenever I was too weak or too tired to stop her. Rick pulled out his phone and dialed his mother's number. He put it on speaker and set it on the coffee table between us. She answered on the second ring, her voice already defensive and shaky. Rick asked her directly if she went through my phone while I was in recovery at the hospital. She stammered something about just checking the time, but Rick cut her off. He asked about the photos she took of my screen. He asked about the work emails she forwarded to herself from my boss. His voice stayed level, but I could hear the edge underneath it, sharp and cold. She tried to deflect and change the subject, asking why he was interrogating her like she was a criminal when she'd only been trying to help her son. Rick pressed harder. He asked her point blank if she'd been going through my phone regularly, and there was a long silence on the other end. Then she broke. Her voice got high and fast as she admitted she'd been checking my phone to protect him. She said she had a bad feeling about our marriage from the start, and she thought if she could find proof that I was cheating or hiding something major, she could save him from getting hurt like his cousin got hurt in his divorce. She said she was just being a good mother looking out for her son's best interests. Rick's voice went ice cold. He asked how going through his wife's phone while she was unconscious from surgery was protecting anyone, how deleting her photos was being helpful, how forwarding her work emails was showing concern. The line went quiet except for his mother's breathing, and then she started crying. She said she just wanted to make sure I was good enough for him, that I wasn't going to hurt him or take advantage of him, or leave him once I got tired of him. Rick ended the call without saying goodbye. We sat there in silence for what felt like 20 minutes, but was probably more like 5. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and a car driving past outside. Finally, Rick turned to me and said he was sorry. He said he was sorry for not believing me about his mother's behavior over the years, sorry for thinking I was exaggerating or being too sensitive when I told him about her constant criticism and nosiness. He said she always seemed so sweet and concerned when he was around, asking questions about our lives and offering to help with things. He thought that was normal mother stuff. Now he could see she'd been performing for him, acting like the caring mother when he was watching, then turning into someone else the second he left the room. I told Rick about everything else that happened during my recovery. How his mother had rearranged our kitchen cabinets and made passive-aggressive comments about my organization skills, and how she did things differently in her own kitchen. How she'd gone through our bedroom closet and asked why I owned certain clothes, implying they were too tight or too short or too expensive. How she'd questioned every friendship and work relationship I mentioned, asking suspicious questions about who these people were and how I knew them and whether Rick had met them. Rick looked more and more uncomfortable as I listed everything. His shoulders hunched forward and he kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He said he had no idea how much his mother had invaded our home and our marriage while I was too weak from surgery to stop her or defend myself. The phone rang around 8:30 and Rick's dad's name showed up on the screen. Rick answered and put it on speaker. His dad's voice sounded tired and apologetic right from the start. He said his wife had come home upset and crying, and she'd told him everything about the phone and the confrontation with Rick. He said he wasn't surprised because he'd watched her become more and more controlling and paranoid over the years, especially when it came to Rick's relationships. He said she'd done similar things with Rick's previous girlfriends, though never quite to this extreme level. Rick looked stunned. His dad had known his mother was like this and never said anything, never warned him, never tried to stop her from interfering in his relationships and his life. Joseph's voice got softer on the phone, almost apologetic. He said Diane had struggled when Rick moved out for college years ago and called him multiple times a day, asking what he ate for breakfast and whether he was making friends. She'd show up at his dorm unannounced with groceries and cleaning supplies, insisting his roommate wasn't keeping things clean enough. When Rick got his first serious girlfriend in his junior year, Diane found reasons to dislike her, questioning whether she was really smart enough for Rick or if she just wanted his money even though Rick was a broke college student. Joseph said he'd tried to talk to Diane about giving Rick space, but she'd get defensive and say he didn't understand a mother's love or how important it was to protect your children. The pattern got worse after Rick graduated and started working, and then when we got engaged, Diane spiraled. Joseph said she'd cry to him about losing her son and how no woman would ever be good enough for Rick or treat him as well as she did. He admitted he should have put his foot down years ago, but it was easier to let Diane have her way than deal with her emotional reactions. Rick thanked his father for being honest, even though I could see it hurt him to hear how long this had been going on. After we hung up, Rick sat staring at his hands for a while before saying he needed to sleep on everything and figure out what to do next. The doorbell rang at 7:30 the next morning while I was making coffee. Rick was still in the shower and I was barely awake, standing in my pajamas with my hair a mess. I looked through the peephole and saw Diane standing on our porch wearing a nice blouse and holding her purse like she was here for a planned visit. I didn't open the door. I went to the bathroom and told Rick his mother was here, and he wrapped a towel around himself and went to answer it dripping wet. Diane looked surprised to see him like that, and she started talking immediately about how she needed to speak with him alone, because this was between a mother and son. Rick told her no. Whatever she had to say could be said in front of me since I was his wife, and this whole situation involved me. Diane's face changed, her mouth getting tight. She looked past Rick trying to see if I was standing there listening. Rick stepped out onto the porch in just his towel and pulled the door mostly closed behind him so she couldn't see inside. I could hear her voice getting higher as she said she was his mother and deserved respect and privacy with her own child. Rick's voice stayed calm but firm as he said she could either talk to both of us together or leave. Diane tried a different approach, her voice going soft and hurt. She said she'd been up all night worried about him and their relationship, and she just wanted to explain that she'd only been trying to help and protect him like any good mother would. Rick opened the door wider and gestured for her to come inside. She walked in and saw me standing by the kitchen counter. Her whole expression shifted when she looked at me, like I was the enemy who'd stolen her son. She sat down on our couch without being invited and launched into this long explanation about how she'd always had bad feelings about certain people in Rick's life, and her instincts had been right before. So when she noticed concerning things about me, she felt she had to investigate. Rick sat down across from her, still in his towel with water dripping onto our hardwood floor. He asked her what gave her the right to go through someone's phone while they were unconscious from surgery. Diane's eyes got watery, and she said she knew it looked bad, but she was just so worried about him and wanted to make sure I was being faithful and honest. She said finding those male names in my contacts and seeing how I talked about my boss made her concerned I wasn't fully committed to the marriage. Rick cut her off. He said going through someone's phone without permission was a violation of privacy and trust, and doing it while that person was unconscious from surgery was especially disturbing. Diane started crying, pulling tissues from her purse. She said she was only trying to help and she'd never meant to hurt anyone. Rick's voice got harder. He said helping would have been respecting boundaries, not invading them. Helping would have been trusting his judgment about who he married instead of trying to find evidence against me. Diane reached for Rick's hand, but he pulled it back. She looked shocked, like he'd never refused her physical comfort before. She turned to me with tears running down her face and said she was sorry if I felt violated, but surely I could understand a mother's concern for her son. I stayed quiet. This needed to come from Rick, not me. If I said anything, Diane would use it as proof that I was controlling him or turning him against her. Rick stood up and told his mother she needed to leave. Diane's tears stopped immediately. She said she wasn't leaving until they worked this out and she wasn't going to let me destroy their relationship. Rick walked to the door and opened it. He said she could leave on her own or he'd help her leave, but either way she was going. Diane looked between us, her face getting red. She stood up slowly and grabbed her purse. She told Rick he was making a huge mistake and I was manipulating him, and someday he'd realize his mother was right all along. Rick stood at the open door waiting. Diane walked past him and stopped on the porch. She said from now on she wanted to be told before she visited, and she wasn't going to just show up anymore since clearly she wasn't welcome in her own son's home. Rick's jaw tensed. He said that was exactly what needed to happen. She needed to call before visiting rather than just showing up. Diane's face went from red to purple. She accused Rick of letting me control him and isolate him from his family, using the exact words Joseph had warned us she'd use. She said I was probably standing there feeling proud of myself for turning her son against her. Rick's voice stayed level. He said having boundaries wasn't isolation, and respecting his wife's privacy wasn't being controlled. It was being a good husband. Diane made a sound like a wounded animal and walked to her car. She got in and slammed the door hard enough that our neighbor looked out their window. Rick closed our front door and stood there for a minute before walking to the couch and sitting down heavily. His shoulders slumped forward and he put his head in his hands. I sat down next to him but didn't say anything. He'd just confronted his mother for the first time in his life, and I could see how much it cost him. I stayed quiet while Rick processed everything. He sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. His hands kept rubbing his face like he could wipe away what he'd just learned about his mother. I wanted to comfort him, but wasn't sure if he'd accept it right now. After maybe 10 minutes, he stood up and said we needed to talk to someone who could help us figure this out. He pulled out his phone and started searching for family therapists in our area. I was surprised he was taking it this seriously, but also relieved. He called 3 places before finding someone who could see us that week. The therapist's office was in a small building near downtown. We sat on a gray couch while the therapist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, asked us what brought us in. Rick explained everything from the surgery to his mother's confession about checking my phone regularly. I added details about the deleted photos and forwarded emails. The therapist listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When we finished, she asked Rick how he felt about discovering his mother had invaded my privacy. He was quiet for a moment, then said he felt betrayed. He'd always trusted his mother's judgment, and now he questioned every concern she'd ever raised about me. The therapist nodded and explained that his mother's behavior wasn't about protection, but about control. I shifted on the couch, feeling uncomfortable about what I needed to say next. The therapist noticed and asked if something was bothering me. I admitted I felt guilty about the decoy phone trick even though it exposed the truth. It felt manipulative, like I'd stooped to Diane's level by setting a trap. The therapist leaned forward slightly. She said setting a boundary test wasn't the same as invasion. I was protecting myself and revealing a pattern, not violating someone's privacy. Diane had already been going through my real phone without permission. All I did was give her a chance to stop, and she didn't take it. The therapist asked if I would have gone through Diane's phone if the situation was reversed. I said no. I wouldn't have touched her things without asking. The therapist said that difference mattered. My action was defensive, not offensive. Rick reached over and squeezed my hand. The therapist turned back to Rick and asked if there was anything else he wanted to share. Rick's jaw tightened. He said he was angry at himself for not seeing his mother's behavior sooner. He'd made me feel like I had to prove she was invading my privacy instead of just believing me. His voice cracked a little when he mentioned how he'd looked through my phone at the hospital because his mother convinced him I was hiding something. The therapist asked how that made him feel now. Rick said it made him feel like a terrible husband. He should have trusted me about Jordan being my boss instead of questioning me when I was still groggy from surgery. The therapist worked with us on rebuilding trust between us. She said the damage wasn't permanent, but it would take time and consistent action from Rick to show me he prioritized our marriage over keeping peace with his mother. 3 days after our first session, Rick's phone rang while we were eating dinner. He looked at the screen and his face went tight. It was Diane. He answered and put it on speaker without asking if I minded, which I appreciated. Diane's voice came through sharp and demanding. She wanted to know if Rick was in therapy and accused me of brainwashing him with a therapist's help. Rick's voice stayed calm. He told her we were working on our marriage and establishing healthy boundaries with extended family. Diane said therapy was just me manipulating him and turning him against his own mother. Rick said her reaction to us getting help told him everything he needed to know about whether she respected our relationship. Diane started crying, asking why he was doing this to her. Rick said he wasn't doing anything to her. He was protecting his marriage. Diane hung up without saying goodbye. The next week, my mother Martha arrived to help with my continued recovery. She knocked before coming in even though I'd given her a key years ago. She asked where I wanted her to put her suitcase instead of just picking a room. She asked if she could make tea instead of going through our cabinets looking for mugs. Rick noticed the difference immediately. That evening, he commented on how Martha asked before opening anything or going into rooms with closed doors. She didn't make comments about our furniture or decorating choices. She didn't ask why we had certain items or question our spending. Rick looked embarrassed as he realized how different Martha's visit was from his mother's daily invasions during my recovery. Martha and I were folding laundry in the living room the next afternoon when Rick came home from work early. Martha asked him to sit down because she wanted to talk to him about something. Rick looked nervous but sat in the armchair across from us. Martha said she'd watched Diane undermine me for years at family gatherings with subtle criticisms disguised as concern. She'd seen Diane make comments about my cooking being too spicy or too bland, my job being too demanding or not impressive enough, my family being too loud or too distant. Martha said she was glad Rick was finally seeing what his mother was really like. Rick's face went red. He apologized for not noticing sooner. Martha reached over and patted his hand. She said it was hard to see toxic patterns in your own family, especially when you grew up thinking that behavior was normal. Rick went to lunch with his colleague Blake a few days later. When he came home, he seemed lighter somehow. I asked how lunch was, and he said Blake had mentioned he seemed different lately. More stressed, but also more present and less distracted by his phone. Rick had confided a little about the situation with his mother. Blake shared that he'd gone through something similar with his own controlling parent and had to set hard boundaries to protect his marriage. Blake said it was difficult at first, but his relationship with his parent eventually improved once the boundaries were established and enforced. Rick said it helped to know other people had dealt with this and survived it. 2 days later, an email arrived addressed to both Rick and me. It was from Diane. The subject line said, "My sincere apology." Rick and I read it together on his laptop. Diane apologized for going through my phone, but then spent 3 paragraphs justifying it by listing all her concerns about our marriage and my behavior. She said she noticed I was secretive about my work life. She worried about how many male colleagues I mentioned. She thought my friendship with Daniel from college was inappropriate, even though he was married with kids. She said the birthday card he sent me years ago seemed too personal. The email went on and on, turning her apology into an accusation. Rick closed the laptop looking frustrated. We brought the email to our next therapy session. The therapist read it carefully and said this was a non-apology that blamed the victim. Diane was saying sorry while making it clear she believed her actions were justified. The therapist said we didn't need to respond to it or accept responsibility for Diane's choices. 2 weeks after Rick confronted his mother at our house, Diane texted him asking to meet for lunch to talk things through. Rick showed me the message. I expected him to want to go alone, but he said he'd only meet her if I came along. He texted back telling Diane I'd be there too. Diane's response took several minutes. Finally, she agreed, though her message made it clear she'd wanted to talk to Rick privately. We met her at a restaurant halfway between our house and hers. Diane was already seated when we arrived. She stood up and hugged Rick but barely looked at me. She started talking about the weather and asking Rick about his promotion. Rick let her make small talk for maybe 5 minutes before redirecting the conversation. He said we weren't there to chat about work and weather. We were there to discuss boundaries and what needed to change for them to have any relationship going forward. Diane's smile faded. She folded her hands on the table and said she understood she had overstepped. But then she added that everything she did was motivated by love and concern for Rick's happiness. Rick's voice stayed level. He said love didn't justify invasion of privacy. Concern didn't excuse manipulation and lying about what she found on my phone to create suspicion between us. Diane's eyes filled with tears. She looked at me like I was supposed to defend her or soften Rick's words. I stayed quiet and kept my face neutral. I opened my mouth for the first time since we sat down. I told Diane she deleted photos from my phone. She forwarded my work emails to herself. She changed my wallpaper. Those weren't accidents or looking at something out of concern. Those were deliberate invasions. Diane's face went pale and then red. She tried to backtrack immediately. She said maybe she accidentally swiped on some photos while looking at the screen. She didn't remember forwarding anything. The wallpaper must have been a mistake. Her voice got higher and faster with each excuse. Rick cut her off. He said we had proof from the nurse who saw her taking pictures of my phone screen with her own phone. Diane's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She looked at Rick like he'd betrayed her by believing me over her. Her hands started shaking on the table. She pressed them flat against the surface to hide it. The facade she'd been maintaining cracked right in front of us. She admitted she thought if she could find evidence I was wrong for Rick, he'd leave me. Then she'd have her son back. The words came out in a rush like she'd been holding them in for years. She said she knew Rick would pick someone eventually, but she thought it would be different. She thought she'd still be the most important woman in his life. Instead, I took him away and she barely saw him anymore. The honesty shocked me even though I'd suspected this was her motivation. Hearing her say it out loud made it real and painful. This was never about protecting Rick from a bad wife. It was about not wanting to share him with anyone. Rick's voice went quiet in that way that meant he was really upset. He told his mother he wasn't something to be possessed or won back. Her inability to accept his marriage was damaging their relationship way more than I ever could. Diane started crying. Real tears this time. Not the manipulative kind she used when she wanted sympathy. She said she just wanted to be important in his life. Rick said she could be, but not at the expense of his wife's dignity and privacy. Not by invading our home and creating suspicion between us. Not by going through my phone while I was unconscious from surgery. Diane wiped her eyes with her napkin. She asked what he wanted from her. Rick listed the rules clearly. She had to call before visiting. She couldn't be alone in our home. She didn't get keys or access to our personal spaces. She needed to stop making comments about our marriage, my work, or my relationships. Each rule made Diane's face tighter. She agreed, but her voice was flat. I could see the anger and resentment behind her eyes even as she nodded. She thought these boundaries were punishments instead of basic respect. The lunch ended awkwardly with Diane leaving first. She hugged Rick stiffly and didn't look at me at all. Rick and I drove home in silence for the first 10 minutes. Then he said he felt sad about how his relationship with his mother had changed. His voice cracked a little on the word sad, but he knew it was necessary and long overdue. I reached over and squeezed his hand. I told him having boundaries didn't mean he loved her less. It meant he was protecting what we built together while still maintaining a relationship with her. Rick nodded but kept his eyes on the road. He said he kept thinking about all the times his mother made little comments about me over the years. He always told himself she meant well or I was being too sensitive. Now he saw those comments for what they were. Attempts to undermine our marriage and make him doubt me. We got home and Rick's phone rang almost immediately. It was his dad. Rick put it on speaker so I could hear too. Joseph said he was proud of Rick for standing up to Diane. His voice was warm but also sad. He said he should have done more to check her controlling behavior over the years. He'd watched her get worse as Rick grew up and moved out, but he didn't intervene enough. Rick thanked his father for the support, but I could hear anger creeping into his voice. He said it was hard to hear that Joseph saw the problem, but didn't do more to stop it when Rick was growing up under that controlling parenting. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he admitted he'd failed Rick in that way. He said he thought Diane would ease up on her own as Rick became an adult. Instead, she just found new ways to maintain control. The call ended with Joseph promising to talk to Diane about respecting the boundaries we set. Rick put his phone down and rubbed his face with both hands. At our next therapy session, I talked about how the invasion affected my sense of safety in my own home. I explained that I used to feel comfortable leaving my phone anywhere or having personal items in shared spaces. Now I felt like I had to guard everything. I didn't trust that my privacy would be respected even in my own house. The therapist asked Rick how that made him feel. Rick said it made him angry at his mother and ashamed that he didn't protect me better. He said he should have noticed her snooping earlier. He should have believed me when I told him she made me uncomfortable. The therapist helped us work through how Rick could prove he prioritized our marriage and my well-being over keeping peace with his mother, even when it was uncomfortable. Even when Diane played the victim or tried to guilt him. Rick committed to maintaining the boundaries no matter how much his mother pushed back. He said he wouldn't let her manipulate him into giving her access to our home or privacy again. We spent the rest of the session planning how to handle future situations where Diane might test the rules. The therapist gave us scripts for shutting down her attempts to cross boundaries without getting pulled into arguments. 3 weeks after the lunch with Diane, I was finally recovered enough from surgery to return to work. My boss Jordan called me into his office my second day back. He asked how I was feeling and if I needed any accommodations while I got back into the swing of things. I said I was fine and ready to work. Jordan nodded but looked concerned. He said I seemed different, more guarded about my personal life, less likely to share casual details about my weekend or family during team meetings. I realized he was right. Before the surgery and everything with Diane, I used to chat easily about my life outside work. Now I kept everything vague and surface level. I told Jordan I was just being more private lately. He said that was fine, but wanted to make sure nothing was wrong. I appreciated his concern but didn't want to explain the whole situation with my mother-in-law. I just said I was dealing with some family stuff and preferred to keep work and personal life more separate for now. Jordan accepted that and changed the subject to a project I'd be working on. But I noticed the change in myself throughout the day. I didn't join the casual conversations in the break room. I didn't share photos or stories like I used to. Diane's invasion made me more protective of information even with people I trusted. I hated that she'd changed me in that way. That evening, Rick asked how my first few days back at work went. Then he asked how I was feeling about his mother and whether the boundaries were working. I told him I appreciated that he kept checking in instead of hoping the issue would just disappear. Rick said he didn't want to be the kind of husband who avoided difficult conversations. He wanted to make sure I felt safe and respected in our marriage and home. We talked about how Diane hadn't tried to contact us since the lunch except for one text asking Rick about his work. He'd responded briefly but didn't engage beyond answering her question. The distance felt weird but necessary. Rick admitted he missed the relationship he used to have with his mother. But he knew that relationship was built on him not seeing her clearly. This new dynamic was more honest even if it was less comfortable. 2 days later, our doorbell rang on a Saturday morning. Rick answered it and I heard Diane's voice in the entryway. She was saying she brought groceries as a peace offering since she knew I'd been back at work and probably didn't have time to shop. Rick's voice was firm. He told her she needed to call before coming over. Diane's tone shifted to hurt and confused. She said she was just trying to be helpful and bring us food. Rick repeated that she needed to call first. That was the boundary we'd set, and she'd agreed to it. Diane started saying she didn't think bringing groceries counted as a real visit. Rick cut her off. He said any time she came to our door counted. She needed to call and schedule a time. Diane's voice got louder. She asked if he was really going to turn his own mother away when she drove all the way here with heavy bags. Rick said yes. He told her to call later to schedule a visit, and then he closed the door. I heard Diane say something else outside, but Rick locked the door and walked back to the living room. His hands were shaking slightly. I asked if he was okay. Rick said that was harder than he expected. Turning his mother away at the door felt cruel, even though he knew it was necessary. Diane had tested the boundary within 2 weeks exactly like the therapist predicted she would. Rick had passed the test by staying firm, but it clearly cost him emotionally. I sat with Rick on the couch while he stared at his phone. His mother's contact name kept lighting up the screen every few minutes. He rejected the first 3 calls without answering. On the fourth call, he finally picked up and put it on speaker. Diane's voice came through shaky and high. She said Rick was being cruel and she couldn't believe her own son would shut her out like this. Rick's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. He told her the boundary was simple. She needed to call before coming over. That was it. Diane's crying got louder. She said bringing groceries shouldn't count as a real visit. Rick repeated that any time she came to our door counted as a visit. She needed to schedule it first. Diane switched tactics. She asked if he really wanted to hurt his mother this badly over something so small. Rick said it wasn't small. It was about respect. He asked if she wanted to schedule a time to come over this weekend. There was silence on the other end. Then Diane said she couldn't believe what I'd turned him into. Rick's face went red. He told her this wasn't about me. This was about her behavior. Diane said she'd call back when he was ready to be reasonable. Then she hung up. Rick set his phone down and his hands were shaking worse than before. He said that felt awful, but he knew he did the right thing. I squeezed his shoulder and we sat there not talking for a while. 2 days later, Joseph showed up at our door alone. He looked tired and older than I remembered. Rick let him in and we all sat in the living room. Joseph apologized right away for not doing more to stop Diane's behavior over the years. He said he knew she had control issues, but he always thought it was just her being protective. Rick asked what he meant by control issues. Joseph started telling stories about Rick's childhood. How Diane would go through his backpack every single day after school. How she'd read his diary and then bring up things he wrote about during dinner to embarrass him. How she'd call his friends' parents to check if he was really where he said he'd be. How she installed software on his computer to track every website he visited. Rick's face went pale as his dad talked. Joseph said Diane told herself she was keeping Rick safe. But really, she couldn't handle the idea of Rick having any part of his life she didn't control or know about. Rick asked why Joseph never stopped her. Joseph said he tried a few times, but Diane would get so upset and make everything so miserable that it seemed easier to just let her do her thing. He looked ashamed as he said it. Rick was quiet for a minute. Then he said he always thought that stuff was normal. That all moms checked on their kids like that. Joseph shook his head. He said what Diane did went way beyond normal parenting. Rick started connecting more dots. He talked about how he never felt comfortable having girlfriends in high school because his mom would interrogate them. How she'd show up unannounced at his college dorm. How she cried for weeks when he moved out after graduation. Joseph confirmed that Diane had a breakdown when Rick got engaged to me. She told Joseph that she was losing her son and didn't know how to handle it. Rick looked sick. He said he spent so much time trying to make his mom feel better about our marriage that he never questioned whether her feelings were reasonable. Joseph said that was exactly what Diane wanted. She trained Rick from childhood to prioritize her emotions over his own needs. At our next therapy session, Rick brought up everything his dad told him. The therapist listened carefully, and then said something that seemed to hit Rick hard. She explained that Diane's behavior wasn't really about me at all. If Rick had married anyone else, Diane would have done the same things to that person. The real issue was that Diane couldn't accept Rick as an independent adult. She needed to control him to feel secure. Rick sat back in his chair, looking relieved and sad at the same time. He said he'd been feeling torn between protecting me and loving his mother, like he had to choose one or the other. The therapist said that wasn't true. The choice was between enabling Diane's unhealthy patterns or having an honest relationship with her. Rick could still love his mother while refusing to let her control his life. I watched Rick process this. He said it made sense, but it was hard to accept that his mother's problems with me weren't actually about me being a bad wife. They were about her being unable to let him grow up. The therapist nodded. She said this realization was important because it meant Rick could set boundaries without feeling like he was picking sides. He was just refusing to participate in an unhealthy dynamic. A week later, a card arrived in the mail addressed to Rick. Inside was a note from Diane. She apologized for showing up without calling and said she understood why we needed boundaries. She asked for another chance to prove she could respect the rules we set. The note seemed genuine. Rick read it 3 times. He looked at me and asked what I thought. I said we could try having her over for dinner if he wanted. Rick called his mother and told her she could come over Saturday evening. He made it clear she needed to follow all the boundaries we established. No comments about our home or marriage. No invasive questions. No trying to get Rick alone. Diane agreed. Rick seemed cautiously hopeful after the call. He said maybe his mom was finally taking this seriously. Saturday came and Diane arrived exactly on time. She brought flowers and handed them to me with an awkward smile. We sat down for dinner and the tension in the room was thick. Diane complimented the food but didn't add any comments about how I could have made it better. She asked Rick about work but didn't interrogate him about his coworkers. She talked about a book she was reading instead of asking personal questions about our finances or plans. Every interaction felt careful and measured. Rick kept glancing between his mother and me like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing did. Diane followed every single boundary we'd set. It wasn't comfortable or warm. The conversation stayed surface level, but it was civil. When Diane got up to use the bathroom, she asked which one she should use instead of just wandering around our house. Rick looked surprised but pleased. After dinner, Diane thanked us for having her over and left without trying to stay longer or push for more time alone with Rick. Rick closed the door behind her and let out a long breath. He said that was weird but good. Maybe they could actually have some kind of relationship if his mom kept this up. After Diane left, I told Rick I was proud of him. I could see how hard it was for him to stay firm on the boundaries even during an awkward dinner. Rick admitted it felt completely unnatural. He said being so formal and careful with his own mother made him sad, but he knew it was necessary. He couldn't trust her to respect our privacy and marriage without these rules in place. At least not yet. I asked how he felt about the whole evening. Rick said it was a start, not the relationship he used to have with his mother. But maybe that relationship was never as healthy as he thought it was. This new version was more honest even if it was less comfortable. We sat on the couch and Rick put his arm around me. He said he was sorry it took him so long to see what was really happening. I told him what mattered was that he saw it now. In our next therapy session, we talked about how the violations still affected me. The therapist asked how I felt in our home now. I admitted I still felt anxious sometimes. Like Diane might show up or someone might go through my things. Even though we had boundaries now, the feeling of being invaded hadn't fully gone away. The therapist suggested we change our locks. I said Diane never had keys, so changing them seemed pointless. The therapist explained it wasn't really about keeping Diane out physically. It was about taking a symbolic action to reclaim our space, making a clear statement that our home belonged to us, and we controlled who entered it. Rick liked the idea immediately. He said we should do it this weekend. I felt a small weight lift off my chest just thinking about it. That weekend, Rick surprised me with something else. He said he'd been thinking about the safe we used to keep important documents in at his old apartment. He suggested we get a new one and keep my phone in it at night along with our passports and other private papers. I stared at him. He said he knew Diane wouldn't be alone in our home anymore, but he understood I needed to feel completely secure that my privacy was protected. He wanted me to have that peace of mind. His thoughtfulness about my continued anxiety made my chest tight. This was the Rick I married, the one who paid attention and cared about how I felt, not the Rick who was so focused on keeping his mother happy that he missed what was happening right in front of him. We went to the store that afternoon and bought new locks and a small safe. Rick installed everything himself. When he was done, he handed me the only key to the safe. He said I should be the one who controlled access to it. Anita came over for dinner a few weeks later. She'd heard bits and pieces about everything that happened, but wanted to see how Rick was handling it all. During dinner, Rick was different from she'd seen him before. When Anita made a joke about mother-in-laws, Rick didn't get defensive or try to defend Diane. He actually laughed and agreed. After dinner, Anita pulled me aside in the kitchen. She said she was impressed. She admitted she'd been worried Rick would eventually give in to his mother's guilt trips, and things would go back to how they were. But watching him maintain firm boundaries tonight gave her real confidence in our marriage. She said Rick seemed more like himself, more present and less distracted. I realized she was right. Rick had been carrying the weight of managing his mother's emotions for so long that it affected everything else. Now that he'd put that weight down, he had energy for our actual relationship. The phone rang one evening in early November. Rick answered and put it on speaker. Diane asked if she could host Thanksgiving at her house with the whole family. Rick said we'd come, but only if she agreed to some conditions. No comments about our marriage, no comments about my cooking, no comments about my family, no comments about anything that had been a problem before. Diane was quiet for a second. Then she said she agreed. I could hear the reluctance in her voice even through the phone. She wanted to argue or ask why we needed so many rules, but she held back. Rick confirmed the date and time. After he hung up, he looked at me. I said it would probably be fine. We'd survived the dinner at our house. We could handle Thanksgiving at hers. Thanksgiving at Diane's house arrived faster than I wanted. Rick and I showed up with a pumpkin pie I baked the night before. Diane greeted us at the door with a smile that looked forced but not hostile. She hugged Rick first, then me, though her arms barely touched my shoulders. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing. Joseph was already in the living room watching football with Rick's uncle and two cousins I'd met a few times before. Diane led us to the kitchen where she had food covering every counter. She asked if I could help her with the gravy. I said sure and stood next to her at the stove while she stirred the pan. She made small talk about the weather and asked how work was going. I answered carefully, keeping my responses short but polite. Rick stayed close by, leaning against the doorway where he could see both of us. When we all sat down to eat, Diane said grace and thanked everyone for coming. The meal started fine. People passed dishes and complimented the food. Then Diane looked at me and said the turkey was a little dry this year because she tried a new recipe she found online. She said next time she'd stick to traditional methods that actually work. Rick put down his fork and looked at his mother. He said the turkey tasted great and asked her not to make comments like that. Diane's face went red. She said she was just being honest about her cooking. Rick said she could be honest without taking shots at other people's methods. The table went quiet. Diane pressed her lips together and picked up her wine glass. Joseph cleared his throat and changed the subject to the football game. The rest of dinner continued with careful conversation. Diane made one more comment about how some people don't appreciate family traditions. Rick immediately asked what she meant by that. Diane backed down and said nothing, just that she valued family time. Everyone could see the shift. Diane wasn't running the show anymore. Rick was watching her and calling out anything that crossed the line. After dinner, Joseph asked if I'd help him bring more chairs up from the basement. I followed him downstairs where he turned to face me. He said he wanted to thank me for how I'd handled everything with Diane. He said he knew it wasn't easy, and he appreciated that I never demanded Rick cut her off completely. I told him I never wanted that. I just needed to feel safe in my own home and marriage. Joseph nodded and said he understood. He admitted he should have stepped in years ago when Diane started getting too involved in Rick's life. He said he was proud of Rick for finally setting boundaries. We carried the chairs upstairs and the rest of the evening passed without incident. Diane kept her comments to herself. The weeks after Thanksgiving brought a new routine. Rick called his mother every Sunday afternoon. Their conversations lasted about 20 minutes. They talked about work and weather and what they'd done that week. Diane visited our house once or twice a month, but always called first to ask if we were free. When she came over, she stayed in the living room or kitchen. She didn't ask to see other rooms or comment on how we organized things. The visits felt stiff and formal, but they were civil. Rick seemed relieved that they could have some kind of relationship even if it wasn't close like before. I noticed he stopped checking his phone constantly to see if his mother had texted. He stopped making excuses for her behavior or trying to explain away her comments. When she did slip up and say something pointed, he addressed it right away instead of letting it slide. I started sleeping through the night without waking up to check if the doors were locked. The new locks Rick installed helped, but it was more than that. I trusted that Rick would protect our privacy even when it was hard. I trusted that he wouldn't let his mother back into our home unsupervised or give her access to our personal things. That trust made everything else easier. 6 months passed. Spring came and the weather warmed up. Diane called Rick one evening and asked if we'd be willing to try family therapy together. She said she wanted to work on rebuilding trust and thought a professional could help. Rick put the phone on speaker so I could hear. He told his mother we'd think about it and talk to our therapist first. After he hung up, we looked at each other. I said I was surprised she suggested it. Rick said he was too, but maybe it was a good sign. We brought it up at our next therapy session. Our therapist asked what we hoped to get out of family therapy with Diane. Rick said he wanted his mother to understand why her behavior was wrong and how it damaged our relationship. I said I wanted to feel like Diane respected me as Rick's wife and as a person. The therapist said family therapy could help if Diane was genuinely willing to take responsibility instead of just trying to manipulate the situation. She warned us that some people use therapy as a way to look good without actually changing. We decided to try it. Rick called Diane back and said we'd do family sessions if she agreed to be honest and work on real change. Diane said yes. The first family therapy session was in a small office with 3 chairs arranged in a triangle. Diane arrived first. She sat with her purse in her lap and her hands folded on top of it. Rick and I came in together and sat across from her. The therapist introduced herself and explained how the sessions would work. She said this was a space for honest communication, and everyone needed to be willing to listen and take accountability. Diane nodded. The therapist asked Diane to start by sharing why she wanted to do family therapy. Diane took a breath and said she felt like she'd lost her son. She said when Rick got married, everything changed and she didn't know how to handle it. She admitted she felt replaced. The therapist asked her to say more about that. Diane's voice shook a little. She said she'd been the most important woman in Rick's life for 30 years. Then I came along and suddenly she wasn't needed anymore. She said she didn't know who she was if she wasn't Rick's mother taking care of him. The therapist nodded and said that was honest. She asked Diane if she could see how trying to stay the most important woman in Rick's life might have caused problems. Diane said she could see that now. The therapist explained that mothers and wives fill different roles. One doesn't take away from the other. Rick spoke up and said he still loved his mother, but he needed her to respect his marriage. Diane started crying. She said she was sorry for going through my phone and for all the comments she'd made over the years. She said she was scared of losing Rick, and that fear made her do things she knew were wrong. I sat there listening. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me stayed guarded. We did family therapy every other week. Diane showed up on time and participated. She talked about her fear of being alone and her struggle to let Rick be independent. The therapist helped her understand that her behavior was controlling instead of caring. Diane admitted she'd justified her snooping by telling herself she was protecting Rick. She said now she could see it was about controlling the situation so she wouldn't lose him. In one session, the therapist asked Diane to apologize directly to me without adding any justifications. Diane turned to face me. She said she was sorry for invading my privacy while I was unconscious. She said she was sorry for going through my phone and my personal things. She said she was sorry for trying to turn Rick against me. She didn't add any buts or excuses. I told her I appreciated the apology. The sessions were hard. Diane still struggled with taking full responsibility. She'd apologize and then add something about how worried she was or how she didn't know what else to do. The therapist kept redirecting her back to owning her choices without justifications. Slowly, Diane got better at it. She started catching herself when she made excuses. She'd stop mid-sentence and rephrase. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I started to feel a small amount of hope that things could keep improving. One night after a therapy session, Rick and I were getting ready for bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress and said something that surprised me. He said he was grateful the phone incident happened. I stopped brushing my teeth and looked at him through the bathroom mirror. He explained that without clear proof of his mother's invasion, he might have kept making excuses for her. He said our marriage would have suffered and he might have lost me. I rinsed my mouth and came to sit next to him. I told him I understood what he meant. Sometimes you need something undeniable to break through denial about someone you love. Rick took my hand. He said the whole situation forced him to see his mother clearly for the first time. He said it was painful, but necessary. My relationship with Diane changed over the following months. It would never be warm or close. We'd never be the kind of mother-in-law and daughter-in-law who went shopping together or called each other just to chat. But it became something workable. Diane learned to ask before assuming things. When she wanted to visit, she called first. When she had a question about our plans, she asked instead of digging through our stuff to find answers. She stopped making pointed comments about my cooking or my job or my family. When Rick told her no about something, she accepted it without guilt trips or manipulation. She respected that Rick's first loyalty was to our marriage. It wasn't the relationship I'd hoped for when I married Rick, but it was honest, and it had boundaries. That made it sustainable. A year after the surgery and the phone invasion, Rick and I were different as a couple. We'd learned how to talk about difficult family issues without avoiding them. We'd learned how to set boundaries together and maintain them even when it was uncomfortable. The violation Diane committed was painful. It damaged trust between Rick and me because he didn't believe me at first. But working through it taught us both how to protect our marriage while still keeping family relationships. Rick was more aware of his mother's patterns. I was more confident in speaking up when something bothered me. We both knew now that boundaries weren't walls to keep people out. They were guidelines to keep relationships healthy. My birthday arrived 3 months after the surgery incident. I wasn't expecting much, just a quiet dinner with Rick and maybe a call from my mom. The mail came around noon while I was working from home. I sorted through bills and advertisements until I found a card with Diane's handwriting on the envelope. My stomach tightened. I almost threw it away without opening it. But something made me slide my finger under the flap and pull out the card inside. The front showed a simple bouquet of flowers. Nothing fancy or overdone. I opened it and saw her handwriting filling most of the inside space. She wrote that she violated my privacy and damaged our relationship. She said she was wrong to go through my phone while I was unconscious. She acknowledged that her behavior during my recovery was invasive and hurtful. There were no buts or excuses, no mentions of how worried she was or how she was just trying to protect Rick. Just a plain acknowledgement of what she did and the harm it caused. I read it 3 times looking for the catch, looking for the hidden blame or the subtle suggestion that I had somehow contributed to her choices. But it wasn't there. The apology was clean and direct. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of something that could eventually become forgiveness. I showed Rick the card when he got home from work. He read it silently and then looked at me with surprise in his eyes. He said his mother had never apologized like that before, without defending herself or explaining away her actions. I told him I appreciated the progress she was making, but I also said I wasn't ready to fully trust her yet. Rick understood. He said trust had to be rebuilt slowly through consistent actions, not just words on a card. I put the card in my desk drawer. Not hidden away, but not displayed either. Just somewhere I could find it if I needed a reminder that people could change, even difficult people like Diane. 2 weeks later, Rick came home grinning wider than I'd seen in months. He dropped his briefcase by the door and picked me up in a hug that lifted my feet off the ground. He got the promotion. The regional manager position he'd been working toward when I had my surgery finally came through. His boss called him into the office that afternoon and told him he'd earned it through his consistent performance and leadership skills. I was so happy for him I almost cried. We celebrated with takeout from his favorite restaurant and talked about what the promotion meant for us. Better pay, more responsibility, and validation that his hard work mattered. The next morning, Diane called. Rick put her on speaker so I could hear. She congratulated him immediately. She said she was proud of him and knew he'd worked hard for this opportunity. She asked about the new role and what his responsibilities would be. Then she said goodbye and told him to celebrate properly. Rick hung up and we both sat there in silence for a moment. He looked at me with wide eyes. I asked him what was wrong. He said his mother just congratulated him without making a single comment about me. No subtle suggestions that I might hold him back in his new role. No questions about whether I understood how demanding his schedule would be. No implications that he succeeded despite his marriage rather than within it. Just pure congratulations focused entirely on him and his achievement. I felt a wave of relief I hadn't expected. Those subtle digs had been so constant over the years that I'd learned to brace for them automatically. The absence of them felt strange and significant. Rick said it felt like a real victory, like his mother was genuinely trying to change her patterns instead of just following rules to keep access to him. I agreed. This wasn't just about respecting boundaries we'd set. This was about Diane recognizing that her old patterns were harmful and actively working to replace them with healthier responses. Joseph called a few days after Rick's promotion news. He asked if he could stop by to talk with both of us. We agreed, and he showed up that evening with coffee and pastries from the bakery near his house. We sat in the living room, and Joseph looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. He told us he wanted to share something Diane had asked him to keep private, but he felt we deserved to know. Diane had been seeing her own therapist for the past 2 months. Not the family therapist we'd all attended together, but a separate one focused specifically on her individual issues. Joseph said the therapist was helping Diane work through her control issues and fear of abandonment. Apparently, Diane's own mother had been critical and withholding, and Diane learned early that controlling her environment was the only way to feel safe. When Rick grew up and got married, those old fears came rushing back. She felt like she was losing the one relationship she'd managed to maintain, so she tried to control it through surveillance and manipulation. Joseph said Diane was finally taking personal responsibility for her patterns. She wasn't just following the rules we'd set to maintain access to Rick. She was actually examining why she developed those patterns in the first place, and learning different ways to handle her anxiety and fear. I felt something soften inside me. This explained the genuine apology card and the lack of subtle digs about Rick's promotion. Diane wasn't just performing better behavior. She was doing the internal work to change what drove the bad behavior in the first place. Rick asked his father why Diane wanted this kept private. Joseph said she felt ashamed that it took such a serious violation to make her seek help. She didn't want us to think she was trying to earn points or manipulate us into trusting her faster. She just wanted to do the work quietly and let her actions speak for themselves over time. I respected that. It showed a level of humility and self-awareness I hadn't seen from Diane before. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm glad I trusted my gut about Diane's snooping and found a way to prove it. The decoy phone trick was unusual and some people might call it manipulative, but it revealed a truth that needed to come out. Without clear evidence, Rick might have kept making excuses for his mother's behavior, and our marriage would have suffered permanent damage. Now we have boundaries with his family that actually work. Diane calls before visiting. She respects our privacy and our choices. She doesn't make pointed comments disguised as concern. When Rick tells her no about something, she accepts it without guilt trips or manipulation. Our marriage is stronger because we learned how to handle difficult family issues together instead of avoiding them. Rick knows his first loyalty is to our partnership, not to keeping peace with his mother. I know I can speak up when something bothers me and he'll listen and act. We communicate more honestly about everything now because we had to learn how during the crisis with Diane. And Diane herself is slowly changing. She's learning that respecting people's privacy and autonomy is how you keep relationships healthy, not how you lose them. She's discovering that trying to control someone through surveillance and manipulation only pushes them away. The work she's doing with her therapist is helping her understand that real connection comes from trust and respect, not from gathering information and using it as leverage. Things aren't perfect. They probably never will be. Diane and I will never be close or warm with each other, but we have something functional and honest now. Something that can last because it's built on clear expectations and genuine effort to change, not on pretending problems don't exist or hoping they'll magically resolve themselves. The violation was painful and scary. Waking up from surgery to see someone scrolling through my most private information felt like a nightmare. But working through it taught all of us important lessons about boundaries, trust, and what it really means to respect the people you claim to love.